Trump, for all of his, as I say, narcissistic or tendencies and erratic nature, he has more of a root in internationalism than the succeeding generation. What worries me is less Nick Fuentes' moral lack of scruple, which is reasonably rare, more his ignorance, which is very widespread, and this suicidal, from the United States point of view, commitment to America to cut itself off from all of its allies, and this will be disastrous for all the allies, which Nick Fuentes doesn't care about. But it will also be disastrous for the United States because his historical ignorance doesn't encompass the disasters that the United States brought on itself by isolationism.
I want to start, Helen, by talking about Ukraine. Attempts to find a peace deal seem to wax and wane every day. Later today, Ukraine's going to be presenting its own revised peace plan to the White House. The front page of the Times today is slightly optimistic, with Keir Starmer saying that Europe's getting close to a deal to release £100 billion worth of Russian assets to help Ukraine. These are funds that are frozen in European bank accounts, and they would be used to help Kyiv fight Russia or rebuild the country in the event of a peace deal. But Belgians are protesting because their money is being held in Belgian banks, and they fear they could be held liable for it. Looking at all of this, Helen, it's quite hard not to feel bleak that there's just this sort of tussle going on about what to do while nothing really happens.
Yes, and this is the big test, I think, of the European idea. We see America and Europe moving ever further apart in terms of their approach. Trump just trying to concentrate power in one man. Europe, literally dozens of leaders, and while Trump is allergic to process and caution, that's, Europe's kind of main way of doing things. And I think what we're going to come up against here is, is there ever going to be a threat great enough for Europe to unite, get over all these cultural problems and act quickly and decisively, which is not something it's done in the past.
I mean, one can kind of see where the Belgians are coming from. They don't want to get sort of stuck on the hook for all this money when everyone sort of takes it away and shuffles off. Look, another interesting aspect of this is the hostility one feels from the United States towards Europe. Trump's disdain for Europe is getting more and more obvious over time. There was that, security strategy briefing earlier this week. He talked about civilizational erasure in Europe, Europe going in bad directions and so on. Which way round do you think this works for Trump? Is he kind of behaving like sort of in a manner that is hostile to Europe because he doesn't like Europe? Or does he not like Europe to justify the fact that he's behaving in a manner that's hostile to Europe?
Oh, the latter for sure. And I don't think that Trump cares at all about a good peace. He wants a bad peace that will burnish his reputation. I think that's and another aspect is that he's living in this very sort of dated world, given his age and given how, abreast he is of kind of his interest in geopolitics. He's stuck back in the 70s and 80s when Russia was really a kind of, superpower that he would like to tame. But, that's not the reality. If you're in Europe, that's not the reality. You can see that Russia actually has very little going on except war. And that if some kind of peace was negotiated, it wouldn't be a lasting peace because Putin's government depends on, war and an enemy.
I think that's a really interesting way of seeing it, that he wants to see himself as, Reagan speaking to Gorbachev, and it's just, we're not in that world.
We're not in that world, no. And I think also going back to the Belgian thing, yes, obviously it's complicated and Belgium has, doesn't want to be bullied into taking the rap for all this. But, would Putin seize those assets? Yes. Would Trump seize those assets? Yes. And so that just shows what an uneven sort of playing field Europe is operating on right now.
Keir Starmer always looks happier when dealing with these big international issues. They might not really be getting anywhere, but he doesn't look out of place up there with Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron and Zelensky. It sort of looks like he's playing the role he feels he ought to be playing.
Yes, and I think, I'm not a huge fan of Boris Johnson, but I think Boris Johnson, probably his one big thing was how strong he was on Ukraine. And I think Keir Starmer has kind of taken on that mantle a little bit, and he does look good up there. He does look statesman-like, but does he quite have the power to push into the kind of boldness that is going to be required of him? I don't know.
Let's move on. Let's talk now about a man called Nick Fuentes. He's an anti-Semitic white nationalist influencer, becoming an increasingly influential figure in the Make America Great Again movement. Some Republicans have criticised him, but not Donald Trump and not J.D. Vance, the vice president. He's just been interviewed by the broadcaster Piers Morgan, and Morgan recorded a question from our Times colleague Danny Finkelstein to put to him. Here's a bit of that clip and Fuentes' response as well.
Since he says he's on Team Hitler, you might like to ask him about the fact that Hitler arrested my mum, tried to starve my mum to death, did starve my grandmother to death, sent my great aunt to the gas chamber, my great uncle, my cousin. My grandmother on my father's side ended up being one out of 7 children, the only one that survived the war. So you might ask him whether he wouldn't rather be on Team Mum rather than Team Hitler.
See, that's the reality of your jokes, although I haven't ascertained yet whether you are joking when you say that Hitler was very cool. Are you joking, or do you actually think he was very cool? The most genocidal monster of the last 150 years?
Yeah, the thing is, my generation, we're just done with the pearl clutching. You know,
yeah, you might be, but then your generation hasn't gone through what Danny Finkelstein's family went through. So yeah, maybe the pearl clutching has a way to go for families whose family members
were murdered. Yeah, we got all that. Me mom, like we're. You know, I don't even know who this person is. Why is this person talking to me? This old British guy is saying, me mom got killed by Hitler.
Because he doesn't find it funny when you say Hitler's very cool.
I don't care. I don't care.
I know you don't care. That's fine. You don't have to care.
Well, I'm delighted to say I can speak to that actually not that old British guy right now, because Danny Finkelstein joins me. Hello, Danny.
Hello, I'm me mum. I sound like Dick Van Dyke.
Yes, absolutely. I've often thought that. You sound exactly like Dick Van Dyke. Look, what do you take away from all this, Danny? I mean, because you'd be forgiven for finding it all intensely upsetting, intensely frustrating. Why is it important? Yeah. Why is Nick Fuentes important?
I'm robust enough that someone like Nick Fuentes doesn't upset me. That's after what he's attempting to do. I think there's the big question, obviously, as to whether you should conduct these interviews with people like Nick Fuentes at all. But I think Piers Morgan is correct in doing it and actually challenged him pretty effectively. Of course, there'll be people who'll watch that who'll side with him. He has plenty of fans, and there are an awful lot of people on the internet, so you don't need to have very many fans for it to feel like a lot of people. But in general, I think that when you support genocidal mass murderers, you put yourself outside reasonable discourse, and Piers Morgan succeeded in putting Nick Fuentes in that place in a way that Tucker Carlson did not. Mm-hmm. And I think that has value. It is a bit, not more than a bit disturbing. It's extremely worrying to see a trend on the young Republican right towards people like Nick Fuentes, who are openly and explicitly racist, because he said he was, and who are dismissive of historical precedent. Being young, he may be kind of, at the best, I would say he's gigantically ignorant, and at worst, morally completely insensitive. So, but I think that it's still valuable to project that to people who may not have come across him.
I think it's too kind to say he's ignorant. I think he seems to know precisely what he's talking about. What fascinates me partly about this is the kind of the hiding behind humour, that he says things that he almost pretends not to mean, although he clearly does mean them. How sincerely do you take him?
Yeah, look, I think often with people it's difficult to know where they think the joke stops, and seriousness begins. He's kind of incapable of distinguishing between those things. When I said that he was ignorant, I do mean that. I think that any kind of examination of the events of the war would persuade anybody intelligent, and he is an intelligent. I think Nick Fuentes is an intelligent person, not merely of the moral horror of it, but of the actual danger to the United States. Ultimately, the America First movement, which he belongs to, which persuaded a lot of people before America entered into the Second World War that America was right to stay out of Europe's problems. Ultimately, that was a total failure. They allowed the Nazis to build up a head of steam, and it was disastrous for America. And a lot of American people lost their life, and America lost a lot of treasure as well as blood. So he's simply historically ignorant, even at the strategic kind of self-interest level, let alone the moral horror. It's only possible to be dismissive of the experience of people like my parents or grandparents if you have no real understanding of what happened, and if your surface understanding is is restricted to watching Leni Riefenstahl films.
Well, or if you're a sort of moral vacuum of sorts. I mean, look, Trump has met this guy. They had dinner together a few years ago. Both Trump and J.D. Vance have, I guess, hitherto been reluctant to condemn him, reluctant to distance themselves from him, because he has a lot of support among, as you say, younger Republicans. I suppose the big value of somebody like Morgan doing this interview is that it makes it harder for them to play along with him, right?
The interesting thing, for all of Trump's narcissism and his inability to distinguish between liberal democratic values and authoritarian kleptocrats, he actually didn't meet Nick Fuentes on purpose. Kanye West brought Nick Fuentes to a dinner, and it ended actually pretty unpleasantly. He essentially kicked them out. But the thing that's disturbing is that Trump, for all of his as I say, narcissistic or tendencies and erratic nature, he has more of a root in internationalism than the succeeding generation. What worries me is less Nick Fuentes' moral lack of scruple, which is reasonably rare, more his ignorance, which is very widespread, and this suicidal, from the United States point of view, commitment to America to cut itself off from all of its allies, and this will be disastrous for all the allies, which Nick Fuentes doesn't care about. But it will also be disastrous for the United States, because his historical ignorance doesn't encompass the disasters that the United States brought on itself by isolationism. So his ignorance means that he's simply wrong about the central argument he makes, as well as being able to laugh at someone like me, or to laugh at the murder of my relatives.
Look, I mean, Fuentes and his supporters, they're generally known as the Groypers. They're a particularly sort of nasty strain in the MAGA movement. What do you think? What do you see as the future being there? Is the MAGA movement going to find a way to get rid of them? Are they going to have to succumb to them? What do you expect?
Well, it's because I don't live in the United States. It's difficult to get feel for this entirely. Lots of people who I listen to carefully do think it's a very serious part of the young Republican right. And I do think strategically we're moving into what one might call a post-war world. The post-war world had certain norms, one of which was, as it were, what I call the Munich analogy. You have to stand up to dictators. There was the Cold War, which taught of the dangers of communism. There is the horror of the Holocaust, all those things which set the politics of the post-war era, and those things are fading. So, one of the most significant things about Nick Fuentes is his age. He may be old enough to know better, but is young enough not actually, unless you study history carefully, to know of the events that made America first into such a disaster. And there are lots of people like that. So yes, there is, in my view, a serious movement arising on the right in the United States, which is setting about dismantling, and you saw it with the national security strategy issued last week, which is set about dismantling the post-war foreign policy of the United States and ascribing that to a global elite and to a foreign policy elite in the United States who didn't have America's interests at heart. And I think this is simply wrong, but very dangerous, and pretty widespread. So something that in this country we have to pay attention to. We cannot rely on the United States playing the role that it did. One of the bits I talk about my book Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, and one of the bits that the book begins with is my aunt's arrival and my mum's arrival at the Statue of Liberty, and the effect that had on them. You can't have the Americans aren't going to play that role probably in my children's life. They played in my parents' life.